Welcome, everybody. It's really good to see you here, and some of the later arrivals, we'll let them in as they come in. My name is Brendan Martin. I'm the founder and MD of the social enterprise Public World. For the last couple of decades, we've worked internationally to support change based on enabling and supporting public service professionals to operate with greater freedom and responsibility needed for what are nowadays known as relational services. In 2015, we began a partnership with Buurtzorg of the Netherlands to introduce organizations to its very successful model of neighborhood care, provided through self-managing teams. Trading as Buurtzorg Britain and Ireland for several years, we supported change in around 40 different settings in health and care and also in social housing and some other sectors. That work produced a rich and growing body of knowledge about the barriers and challenges associated with making services more relational and workplaces more participatory. And we've tried to capture that in our learning and development programs, which we call Humanity at the Heart. And that's also the name of our growing online community through which we link the many organizations with which we work and through which we widen the conversation to anybody broadly sharing our purpose and wanting to learn collectively. One feature of that community is our book club, through which any of our members, there's around 400 at the moment, can draw the attention of the community to any book they think's relevant to their shared concerns. And there are a few books recommended on there already, and more will be added soon. So we thought it'd be a nice idea to have a series of monthly online events with an author. And this month, we're delighted to be joined by Bryony Shannon to explore what I think is your first book, Bryony. It's Rewriting Social Care. And welcome, Bryony. And in a minute, I'll ask you to introduce yourself. I'm also joined by Dr. Rose Rickford, who's a Public World Associate Associate Researcher based at the University of Surrey, and by my co-founder of Public World, Steve Cummins, who was going to facilitate our conversation today, but I think I'm going to carry on doing that by agreement with Steve because some tech issues going on there. Bryony and I both have colds, so please bear with us if we mute momentarily. But Steve in Southern California, where nobody gets colds, I suppose. Does anybody ever get colds in Southern California? It never rains there, does it? So I understand, Steve.
It actually rained heavily last week. So, yes, people do get colds, trust me.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
Well, nice to have you here, even if you've abandoned the co-facilitation. But I expect you'll jump in whenever you want. So welcome, everybody. And I'm going to, as I say, let people in gradually as they show up. But first, I'm going to invite Bryony to, really lovely to have you here, Bryony. And thanks for joining us. And tell us a bit about why you wrote this book and what it's all about.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks for having me. My voice is a bit croaky, I'm afraid. I have got a cold. I'm sorry. I will try not to cough everywhere. I might have to mute myself briefly to cough at some point. I'm Bryony. So I've worked in the world of social care for a long time, 20 years or so. Prior to that, my background is really in information and communications. So I kind of came into the world of social care as an information and communications officer many years ago with the council adult social care department, and I didn't have a clue what social care was all about when I first kind of got the job. I'm not quite sure how I got the job. Looking back, I can't have talked anything about social care in the interview, but anyway, I got the job, and then kind of had to learn all about social care and learn all about this. Felt like I had to learn a whole new language to understand what was going on in the world of social care. It was all quite mysterious to me. Anyway, I kind of learned it and started using the language, and my job was communications, so I was writing policies and procedures and web pages and guidance all about social care, so using all of this language all of the time. And then I think actually sort of on reflection, looking back, I started using Twitter more and more because I was producing a bulletin. It was kind of what's happening in social care, called Developments in Adult Social Care. And I put that onto Twitter, and then I was kind of gathering sort of what's on news stories from Twitter and seeing more and more people talking about their experiences of trying to get some support for themselves, the people they loved, how they've been treated within the system. And that really opened my eyes, I think, because looking back, that job was quite separate from anybody who was kind of had very much to do with social care. So I was writing about it, but I wasn't really kind of part of the world at all. Um, and it was through Twitter primarily, and then through people that I got to know through the job, that it really sort of really opened my eyes to what social care could be about and should be about, and that real focus on relationships and focus on humanity and the kind of the whole humanity at the heart, which should be so key to what social care is all about. But it felt like the language was getting in the way of all that, I think, and I was sort of more and more starting to question, why are we using certain terms, certain words to talk about people, to describe the way that we work in social care, what the jobs look like? And I was just curious about it, really. And so I'd started writing a blog called Rewriting Social Care, which has a subheading, subtitle of words that make me go, which had come from a conversation in the council about language and about the kind of concept of banning words. And we didn't really like the idea of banning words because we felt that was kind of not helpful particularly, but just having that sort of the words were the kind of words that we thought, yeah, I'm not really sure that these really fit into the world of social care that we're trying to kind of promote, trying to talk about, trying to create. And so I sort of started the blog to really understand for myself, I suppose, in the first instance, what these words meant, what they represented, what they reflected about how things are now, how sort of attitudes are, how we work, and then how that could change as well, how shifts in the language can help change kind of perceptions and change thinking and actions as well, and change behaviours. And then it kind of took off from there. People liked reading the blogs, wrote more of them, and then I got asked by Jessica Kingsley if I'd like to turn the blog into a book. And so yeah, the book came out about a month ago. So that's kind of how it all happened.
Well, congratulations. Having written a couple of books myself, I know that that's a tough gig to do. So well done on getting it out there. Just building on how you've introduced it a little bit, could you give one or two examples of words that you think reflect the kind of practice that you're trying to challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so many, the words, as I call them, there's so many. And I think the book's divided into four parts, and it sort of starts off with talking about how we communicate about the purpose of social care. And I think quite often the purpose of social care is described very much in kind of sort of quite paternalistic ways in terms of sort of looking after or caring for, and vulnerable is a real kind of term that comes in there. So looking after the vulnerable, caring for the vulnerable. Um, and also words that I think are quite tricky words. So words like independent and safe are used a lot in relation to social care, and this kind of ambition that councils talk about a lot of maintaining independence and keeping people independent. And I think that's a really tricky word because it's interpreted in lots of different ways. In fact, I've just been on a call with the council who claim to, that's part of their kind of strapline. They talk about wanting to support people to live independent lives. So I was asking them about what does independent mean when you're talking about independent, when the council is saying we're supporting people to live independent lives, what does that mean? And it's really, like most people on the call were saying, it's about managing on your own, it's about not needing care, it's about being self-sufficient. And that is one interpretation of independent, absolutely. But the other interpretation is about people having choice and control and autonomy and freedom. And quite often people require a level of support, care and support, in order to have that control over their lives and to have that freedom and autonomy. And I was thinking, if councils kind of aren't really clear of what they're talking about when they're talking about independence, how is that impacting on the way that they're supporting people and the way that they're seeing their roles? So I think they kind of, and the same with safe as well. It's kind of another one of those sort of tricky, deceptive words when we're talking about keeping people safe. And what does safe mean to people? It's like it's a very individual word, isn't it? Of what's safe and safety means to people. So I think they're just words, those are the sort of the sort of overall purpose words. And then I think there's some tricky words around the way that we talk about people. So often very dehumanizing language, like talking about people as cases. There's one of my right up there, most words, the way that social workers particularly often talk about my cases, or I'm dealing with a case, or my caseload, or carrying a heavy case, or all of that kind of language. I think sort of shows, well, it's really dehumanizing. It's the kind of distancing, suggesting that people are kind of just objects, and opening up that approach to just kind of transacting with people, I suppose, that sort of very processy way of working with people. And that then I think translates into the sort of the practicey language of the way that we work. And when you pay attention to that, I think it's often very much the sort of really showing that transactional way of working rather than a relational way of working. So all the kind of screening and triaging and processing and pathways and assessments and reviews and all the things that we do to people, rather than working alongside people, rather than being alongside. So I think that's that very kind of language that I call it sort of sorting office words, the sorting office language, that it reflects that kind of industrial approach to working with people, rather than much more of a kind of a nurturing alongside relational way of working. And then the last part of the book, which wasn't really your question, but the last part of the book is much more about how do we change the story of social care. So how do we change the way that we communicate sort of about what social care is all about? What is the story about what working in social care is all about? And how do we think about change? And again, that sort of shift from very sort of transactional approach to change to really thinking about something that's a lot more fluid and organic.
Thank you, Bryony. Welcome, Heather. And I was going to ask Sarah's, there was some background noise. Before I go on, thanks for that very much, Bryony. If anybody would like to make a comment or ask a question, and we're very much hoping you will want to do that, there's a facility called raising a hand. If you click on React, you'll see a menu there, and you can raise your hand, a digital hand, which will show up in your alongside your image on the screen. And if you can't work that out, just raise a physical hand as well, and I'll try and spot that. The digital one's just a little bit easier to spot, so please do that if you can. Rose, thank you for joining us today. I know that you and I have talked about the book a little bit, both read it, and I know that you've got one or two questions you'd like to ask. So gonna give the floor to you for one or two of those before I invite other questions from others.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's really good to meet you, Bryony, and thanks for the introduction to the book. I thought what you were just talking about, actually, something that really resonated with me about what you were just talking about was that those different meanings of independent, and like that they could come to mean sort of like complete self-sufficiency versus sort of whether we actually mean sort of having some agency in your life. And I think that's a really interesting idea. So that's not really my question. It was just a comment on something on what you were talking about. I think I've got a few questions. Well, I've got lots of things I'd like to ask you, but I think like overall, really, the thing that I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about is, like, as I'm sure like everyone on the call, like, or lots of people will be aware, there's lots of debate, isn't there, about the relationship between language and the world, language and practice, and whether or not whether language evolves, like language within services, whether that evolves as a reflection of how we're practicing, or whether or not we're practicing because in certain ways because that's how we're talking about it. And I think like and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, from your book, what I kind of take from you is a kind of language first approach, like that if we change the language of the way we talk about things, that the practice will follow. I think I probably don't agree with that. I think I probably think that it basically works the other way around, and that's an interesting debate. But I just wanted to sort of start by opening up an opportunity for you to sort of talk a bit about, if you can, about any thoughts you've got about how that works, like how the relationship between, if we change the language we use, what does that mean in terms of what then happens in terms of practice, like maybe in your experience or from your philosophy?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. So I don't think it's necessarily linear like that. I don't think it is that you change the language and then the practice change. I think you need both, and I think they impact on each other. So, and I think quite often we change language without actually changing very much else. So I do think there is a relationship. I was talking about the kind of all the words that the kind of the good words that come in, and quite often we change we add new words. and without sort of any real expectation around a practice change as well. And I don't think then, I think they easily become meaningless. Words become meaningless like that, like sort of strength-based and asset-based, and they're good things. They come from a good place, but they've quickly become jargon. So I don't think it's about changing. You need to change both, but I think what I'm sort of saying in the book, we're starting with how you talk about people and how we think about people and how we think about each other. Wherever we're still seeing people in a kind of deficit-based way, wherever we're still thinking about people as disabled people, particularly older people, as being vulnerable, as being kind of somehow lesser, that's inviting a response and inviting a kind of a practice that is very much about kind of that paternalistic response, I think, about looking after, about keeping people safe, about the call I was on previously, people talking about wrapping people up in cotton wool. So I think it's that rather than, and the same, not just about seeing people, but about seeing the role of social care. If we're seeing it as about keeping people safe, then I think that's inviting that response rather than thinking about social care as being something that is about people flourishing, about people living really good lives, about it being a kind of a springboard for you to get on with living your life. If we're just thinking about social care as a safety net, it's kind of inviting that response, that sort of that minimum, that kind of catch you when you fall type response. So I think unless we do some of that reframing and using language to kind of talk differently about, communicate differently about people, about the role of social care, about what working in social care is all about, it kind of traps us into a way of thinking that then influences how we behave as well. And I mean, I think we've seen that through history with the way that, and with right now, with the way that people come into this country are labelled with certain language, like all the kind of the narrative around the island of strangers and the swarm invasion on our southern coast, illegal immigrants. I was listening to the radio the other day and I heard something about people talking about America and the illegal aliens versus American citizens. And I think just very deliberate framing of people and groups of people. And unless we kind of are aware of that, I suppose, and challenge that, then I think that gets in the way or just influences the way that we think about people and think about what the job is all about. So I don't think it's not one or the other, it's both. I think we need to shift language and practice, but I think it's hard to shift the practice if we don't really pay attention to the language as well. So it's hard to kind of rehumanize things if we're still talking about people as cases, or if we're seeing people as users, service users or clients, whatever, in that kind of very passive role, then it's hard to kind of consider people as having kind of agency and choice and control over their lives. So I think it's about that mindset shift, that framing that we want to probably move away from.
Emma, I see your hand and I'm going to invite you in just a minute. But before I do, Rose, do you want to come back on anything there that Bryony said so that we don't lose the thread of that particular theme?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That was really interesting. And I mean, I think I agree with you, of course, about the kind of both and the like dialectic between practice and language. I think like something I'd be interested in your thoughts on is kind of like causality, like why have you got any sense or take on why we've ended up with the kind of language that currently exists in social care? And if so, like, so how is that, why has that developed the way it has? Because that hasn't just come out of the sky. And I think I'd probably argue that that language has developed because that's how practice is organized and that's how things are organized. So then it's quite reflective of the way that things actually get done. And that happens within a kind of material constraint in terms of finances and bureaucracies and ways of organizing. And I suppose I wondered if you've got any thoughts about that, about how that language has developed as it has, and therefore what is the most effective way to go about changing that way of thinking? Because I agree with you that the language and the ways of thinking are obviously like intimately related. So what have you got any thoughts about kind of what can be done? For example, if you take the case of like a particular adult social care service within a local authority, what are the steps that might be taken to start to change some of that approach?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot in that question, but I think the kind of where it stems from, I think a lot of it stems from the kind of the care management approach to social work, really, that made everything kind of very transactional and introduced that concept of people as sort of customers and that sort of very consumer approach, consumer-led approach. So social workers became kind of brokers. Um, and that idea, that sort of sense of a relationship went really, I think, in that sort of the processing of people and kind of that transactional approach kind of came in then. And then sort of despite the Care Act, which is very much trying to move away from that kind of idea of providing services to meeting needs, I think that's still very much ingrained. And then I think with endless kind of austerity and cuts and things, and that sort of the budget's being tighter and tighter, and there's more and more people trying to do more and more with less and less, that has sort of not helped, obviously. And in a way, I think it's a way of sort of coping with, so if you're talking about people as cases, you're sort of adding that bit of distance, so it makes it a bit easier to do things to people that maybe if you're actually acknowledging that people are people as human beings, the reality of that is almost too much. So I think it's that sort of almost like it's a way of coping with some stuff that's really hard to cope with at the moment. So yeah, it's like changing it is how, and that's a massive question, I think, how we change it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's really interesting insight. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Thanks, Bryony. Emma, please join the conversation and perhaps introduce yourself too as you do so.
Sure. So I'm based up here in Glasgow at the University of Strathclyde in social work and social policy. And first of all, Bryony, I just want to thank, I haven't read the book yet, but I read your blog a while back, and I've also had a colleague forward it on to me who really enjoyed it. So I think it's, it's got resonance with people. And just really enjoying the start of this discussion about that relationship between language and practice, and really interesting. And I guess just maybe a couple of reflections on the language side of things and where we are with our thinking just now up here, and some research we're doing around recording and support for practitioners recording, what gets recorded and what practitioners pay attention to, and how that then influences practice. And I think for the moment, we're kind of stuck on the idea of recording as being a good place to focus. But just one or two reflections on language more broadly. So we've got, across the UK, I'm sure it's fairly similar. Practitioners having to do more with less, as you said, Bryony, and tightening eligibility criteria up here in Scotland. And then so social work staff are being put into these situations where maybe they've been in relatively generous local authorities in the past, and now that's no longer the case. And so in one local authority where I've been working, they've been talking about having to have these difficult conversations with people and getting really wound up about difficult conversations. And it's really interesting. It's from a slightly different perspective, I guess, but one of the people in the room, Rhonda, started saying we need to call them necessary conversations. We just need to change the conversations we're having. Doesn't mean we can't still do good practice, but the framing's a bit different. And it was quite interesting because you could see people's shoulders coming down even through stopping using the word difficult and replacing it with necessary. So that's more from a kind of practice side. But yeah, just in general, I am really, really interested to hear this conversation about that interplay between practice and language. And I guess adding in that dimension of recording, and then therefore, what is it that practitioners are paying attention to? And just following on from the care management sort of / relationship-based practice theme, I guess from an outcomes perspective, we find that there's an overwhelming focus through care management on what is it that we're putting in. So the practitioners are in such a rush, they go in, what's wrong with you? What are we going to put in to fix you? Rather than actually trying to spend that time establishing rapport, mutual understanding, building on strengths, which is an appropriate thing to do in that context, and then work out perhaps what else might be necessary. It's very much going straight to the fix, the output, rather than building that understanding. So I think there's a strong connection between the the recording side of things too.
Thanks, Emma. Bryony, do you have anything to say about that before I ask Colin for his input?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Yeah, absolutely. I think the recording side's really interesting, I think, because there's language used, and the call I was just on, people were saying, but we use this language to sound professional. And I think this kind of sense of what is professional and this sort of professional language. So we were talking about, well, I do lots of work with Tricia Nicol, and we talk about the silly words that we tend to use to talk about everyday life, like access in the community or activities of daily living and personal care, and these terms that we don't use in our ordinary lives at all. We don't talk about this, but suddenly we seem to have adopted this language to talk about people's lives that is so kind of obscure and just silly. And it's another way of othering people, really, that we feel like we have to use this different language. And I think it's not necessarily the language that people are using in conversations with people, but they're feeling that there's this need to record using this professional language. And I think this whole idea of what is professional, and I think what Tricia and I talk about is just trying to shift that idea of what is professional. So away from the idea that it's professional to use all this kind of jargon and these silly words, that it is professional to use language that is ordinary and everyday and that people understand. So that's surely far more professional, as to use ordinary everyday language, especially when we're communicating about people living ordinary lives, which is what social care should be all about. So we shouldn't need this kind of whole different load of jargon to talk about people having a wash and getting dressed and going out and seeing their mates and going to the pub and all of that. So it's a bit strange that we've kind of adopted this like totally random language to talk about people. Does that answer? That's part of the question, I think, wasn't it, about the recording side of things? Yeah, it's an interesting one to unpick. But I think the words that get used about people on records, those words stay with people, don't they, on people's records, and really kind of influence the way. There's a brilliant blog, if I ever find it quickly and put it in the chat, by somebody called Ren Aves, who wrote about her experience of accessing her mental health notes, and the kind of the contrast between how she was presented in things like her references for jobs and her university commendations and things, the language that was used in those compared to the language that was used in her mental health notes. And the language in her mental health notes was all about her being difficult and challenging and refusing to engage in all of those kind of labels. And she writes about how she got that kind of label difficult, which kind of came from a difficult conversation that she'd had, or so that somebody had said was a difficult conversation, and then through her notes it had turned into her being labeled as difficult, and then difficult as expected. So this perception, this kind of these labels that stick with people and then become people's identity, and it's incredibly powerful, I think. So I'll find the link because it's a really great blog to read, and I always link to it when I'm so. In fact, I think in the book I reference it at the back of the book, but I'll see if I can find the link now while we're on the call.
No, thanks, Bryony. Colin, you were next, and after that, Heather, and then Rose.
Well, one brief comment first, Bryony. The idea of professions developing a specialist language isn't at all unusual. They've all done it, from lawyers to architects and particularly people who are dealing with other people who are not professionals. And it becomes, certainly at its worst, it becomes an exclusionary code that I know I had too many encounters with health consultants, who almost deliberately obscure what they're talking about with all sorts of technical terms, which actually are not necessary. One of my battles in academia has always been to try and get people to actually write in plain English rather than academic ease. But I've been around for a long time, including having worked in local government in the 1980s, and I think the big shift that took place was in the beginning of the late 1970s, early 1980s, when up till then social work was dominated by the professions, not by the managers in local authorities, and certainly not by the politicians. The social workers were basically running things. What happened was social work came under attack from two directions. One was the sort of anti-professionalism of the left. There was this sort of this attack on professions being too exclusionary and excluding clients, excluding users of the services. And the other was from the management direction, was the introduction of new public management into local authorities. And the one that won out really was new public management, which is why we've got all this language about customers and all that flows from that. And we're still stuck with it now, 40 years later. And I think, in a sense, it's reinforced the professionalist language amongst social workers as a way of balancing off against the managerialism of the people who are actually running social work departments, social services departments, and policy in government and so on. And the one bit that's never really come out clearly enough is what should have done is the people in the policy domain, the politicians, never actually engage in with the sorts of discussions that you're trying to bring forward, which is how do we actually deal with people who access public services in a way which treats them as equal citizens and not as clients and not as customers, but actually as people with their own rights and activities as citizens. And that bit, I think, is where the weakness comes in, that the politicians at local and national level have never really grasped that properly. There's a lot of rhetoric about it, but they've never actually managed to implement it or tackle it sufficiently. Just one other thing, there's a lot of stuff in political science about framing. I don't know if you come across George Lakoff's work. One of my favourite books is he's got a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, which demonstrates how framing works, because as soon as you mention an elephant, you can't not think about it. and that's his whole point, that if you frame things in a particular way, it's really difficult to break out of that and start thinking about it in a different approach.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's interesting, I think the that whole kind of perception of what the social work role it is as well. And yeah, I mean, I write about that in the book, and it's based on a blog that I wrote, which I called Recruiting Robots, because when I looked at the language of job adverts for social workers, they essentially were, it could have been recruiting robots. It was just like, it was all about carrying a caseload of complex service users and screening and triaging. And it just made me really sad, to be honest, that this is how we are perceiving the role and communicating about the role. And there was nothing about humanity. And they talk about humanity at the heart. There was no humanity in the job adverts at all. And there's no sense of social workers as humans or the people that they were supporting as humans at all. It was very much about service users and clients and cases and customers. So a very dehumanizing kind of narrative around that. And very much that sort of the transactional sort of process-led approach to working with people. So, and no mention kind of rights or social justice or relationships at all in any. And I mean, I wrote that blog about 5 years ago, I think, and every now and again I have a check of job adverts for social workers, and some have gradually started to sound a bit more human. But it is interesting to kind of have a look at the way that the social work role is communicated about, because it's it's sad, I think.
Heather was next on the list, and I've just readmitted her.
Yeah.
But she seemed to drop out. So while she's coming back in, there seems to be a tech issue. Oh, here she is. Heather, Heather, we lost you there for a minute, but we're glad that you're back. Lovely to see you. And please introduce yourself briefly if you could, and then put your point.
Thank you. I was thinking that might be the gods of Zoom stopping me saying something really stupid online to people, so maybe not. My name's Heather Simmons. I'm from the other part of Scotland, Edinburgh. Well, living in Edinburgh now, working for the Thistle Foundation. And we've done a fair bit of work with Brendan around a whole variety of things, but particularly self-organised teams. Thanks very much. I did a wee bit of work. I had the pleasure of working with Bryony and Trish Nichol. And I was really struck by something that Trish had said about how, well, it could have been Bryony, sorry if I'm misquoting it, about how we have enough words and we kind of don't need any more to help us describe some of the situations that we find ourselves in. And we were very fortunate to, when we started the Thistle Academy, which is our introductory course for new starts coming to the organisation, we had a workshop with John O'Brien, and he did this via Zoom. And he talked about why there was a decision made to talk about person-centered work as opposed to anything else, individualized work, anything like that. And it was just fascinating listening to him. Now, I've been doing in quotes, person-centered work for a lot of years, but I hadn't really kind of understood some of the depth of the title. And it struck me that, we've gone through all these evolutions of titles and ways of describing things, but I wonder about the extent to which we've explained them to people, because just changing a word without saying something about why that word and not something else is quite well, I think transformative, that it's the thinking behind the word that makes the difference. So I suppose I'm saying it's kind of the values that support the word that actually lead us to a place where we're likely to do something different because we're using different language. So that would be my kind of thought on it, really. I'm really enjoying the book, Bryony. It's just been great to read it. So yeah, that's my thought. A change of words without any sort of thought about why that word, why it's relevant in that particular situation, won't change anyone behind the word, is the thing that's transformative. And Brian said we talk about person-centered because people are social beings that without qualification they have dignity, they're guided by purpose and desire, and they're equal to others, they develop through engagement. And if we understand and believe all of that, then it makes a difference about how we work with people and how, or work alongside people, how we describe them, what we think our job's about. So yeah, that's probably most that I have to say at the moment. Anyway, thank you for letting me bang on about that.
It's lovely to see you. Yeah, and I agree. I think what I was saying about independent at the start, and the kind of the independent living movement, and the kind of the way that independent is used around autonomy, choice, control, but it's not being seen as that often. It's being seen as managing without support, being self-sufficient, doing things by yourself. And
I'm
I
going to
think
put my video off
it's
because
quite
my
different.
connection's unstable.
So yeah, I absolutely agree. And person-centered, strength-based, I think unless you kind of talk about why, kind of what sits behind them, then they become more jargon, don't they? They become just another phrase that we drop into things.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Just words,
Bryony. Thanks, Heather. Heather, if you could mute again, and I'll bring you in again if you want to come in again. But meanwhile, if you could mute, that would be great. Rose, I'm going to invite you in, but I noticed that Andy's raised his hand, and as he hasn't had an opportunity yet, I'm going to go to Andy first. So, Andy, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So I'm not an author, although I was a director of a social enterprise in the past that published books. So I've been a publisher in the past. I've mainly spent 40 years of my life on or close to the front line, the firing line in social care, on the inside around human services. I haven't read the book, Bryony, yet.
All right, I'll let you off, Andy.
I read some of the blogs. For me, this kind of, it's not a panacea in rewriting social care. It's very challenging. It's tough. I can hear myself. I've seen myself write a number of the words kind of there are in the book because they're in the blogs. So I know that it's in there. But I see it as being instrumental and important in one of the main things in the 21st century of social care to change the power, because this is about power for me, and the power shift that's important. The authorities hold the power. They need to let go of that. People themselves need to feel that they can take back the power, and the providers. Hopefully it will help them if it lands in the laps of providers to think about the language that they're using to do better or do differently around their help. And in terms of the words, and we were talking about Bryony, like framed them as the good words. So my hope is that it will help kind of pull back on some of the depth of it and the originality of seeing too often service world has diluted the origins, and Heather talking about the work of John O'Brien. So we see person-centered planning or supported living or community assets or asset base. All of those origins, the work of John McKnight, of all the others, of all the pioneers, We need to go back and find that again because we've diluted those words. We've kind of like, abused those words from what were the true power and the true sense of what they were about, which is really unfair and sad that that's happened. The other thing I hope that the book will help us sort of find and thinking about the comments around was not the practice before, was about the law. And I was like, and I don't know if it was you or Brian or somebody kind of noted around just the Care Act, wasn't it? The Care Act, the statutory guidance in the Care Act 214, the very first part of it says the core purpose of adult care and support is to help people achieve the outcomes that matter to them in their life. Yet we kind of manage in all our words and our world of this language to kind of just jump right over that and skip that bit and go and pay attention to other things. So I hope my real hope, because I'm an optimist, people who know me well know that I don't write a lot in public. I write at length inside my job. I only write little snippets and write little words when I repost things. That's just my style. I'm a real optimist, and I really hope that this book will play its part in just helping us kind of like get back to kind of a world that's just ordinary and kind of make sense and kind of to have conversations and use a language, just what we would do when we're talking amongst each other, as Brian has already said. So that's my hope for what will come from rewriting social care.
Thanks, Andy. Before I bring in Colin again, Rose, over to you. And of course, Bryony will have another opportunity before we close.
It's been a really interesting discussion, and I've been thinking about some of the things that have been said, and I think I'm coming from a perspective I'm an academic, and I've worked in the voluntary sector quite a bit before I became an academic, but I'm not a social worker, and I haven't got direct experience of working in social care in local authority settings. So I think these questions, what I kind of want to do is ask a few. I'm going to give a few specific examples. So I asked earlier about practice and language, and there's a few things there's lots of things that I was interested in the book about, things that you said that you thought would be good to change, and broadly speaking, I agreed with all of them. And I've just pulled out a few kind of examples, and this is to you, Bryony, but also perhaps open to others with ideas. So I'm just going to list a few examples that I thought of language that you pointed out, and then I'm kind of going to say what is the practice that needs to change that. So the first one I want to raise is, you mentioned moving from referrals to connections, and I wanted to ask what we think that looks like in practice. What is a connection in practice that's different from a referral? And similarly, you point out that a lot of social care, that people need to feel like they're in a place that feels like home. And again, what does that require beyond the way we talk about the places that people live? How do we begin to, what is needed in local authorities and social care in order to start to facilitate that? And I think I'll just stop with those two. I haven't got that long, but I think I'd be particularly interested in thinking about the first one, that referrals and connections one, because I think that's a really specific example of language that does perhaps relate to real practice between people, and what needs to happen in the organisation of services to change that.
Thanks, Rose, and yeah, great. David has raised his hand, and I'm very keen to bring him in. We've just got 10 minutes left, and we're very strict about ending on time. Bryony, would you like to come back on Rose, what Rose had just said before I ask David in? And Colin, I do know you got your hand up, but I'm going to come back to you if we have time.
Yeah, I think that shift really from referrals to connections is the kind of the referral. There's the sort of the sorting office approach to social care, really, that people, and we know this because whenever you try and get any support from anyone, and you phone somebody up and you get told that you've rung the wrong team, or you're going to be put through, and then somebody puts you through and they don't explain why you're calling, even though you've already told the first person. So all of that, just passing people around. And I think that the way that we structure our services, which are often structured around kind of the way that we categorize people, and we rather than kind of common sense, where people live or something, they're kind of with this is a team for complex needs, or this is a team for challenging behavior, or whatever. So our teams are structured badly often and structured around labels rather than structured around I always think just split teams up across geographies, really, because that takes away the need to label anybody at all. It's just, this is where you live. So that shift helps, I think. But yeah, the idea of moving away from that, just passing people on endlessly, so people are endlessly having to tell, and I say it's like what people say about having to tell their story more and more times, but often it's not a story at all, is it? It's just that kind of list of what's wrong with you and kind of what are your needs and everything, rather than who you are and what's important to you. So you get passed around. So I think the idea of the connection is much more that there is that sense of a relationship there, that there is continuity, that you're not having to kind of continue to tell your story again and again and again, but that we are bringing teams, bringing people together, bringing people around people, and so much more connecting people up rather than kind of referring, signposting, handing people off. So it is that very much kind of just, yeah, bringing people together, I think, and connecting rather than referring.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the neighbourhood teams idea. I won't say any more because I know other people are waiting. Thank you.
Thanks both. And David, welcome. And you've introduced yourself, so straight to your question or comment or whatever you want to say.
Thanks, Brendan, and thank you for. I think this is a very timely discussion, and indeed the book, Brian, is extremely timely because clearly, if we're going to have a proper, inclusive, and wide-ranging debate around the Casey Commission, we need to be talking the same language. And I think the split is it's kind of three ways, really. I mean, there is the professional language, which, as you say, probably dates back to the case management era. And then there's kind of a language used by, shall we say, the more active people who draw on care and support, and the people who work with them. And then there's the language used by the general public. And I think, the fact is that most people out there do talk about, the vulnerable, the elderly, and putting mum in a care home. Unfortunately, I think there's a parallel though. I mean, if you go back to in mental health, if you go back to the 90s, when there was the whole sort of moral panic around care in the community, the language that was then used by people generally was, when you look back at it now, was pretty horrifying. I mean, the Press Complaints Commission, which was a pretty useless regulator, but even that, they were, forced to issue a guidance to newspapers saying, please avoid using terms like nutter and basket case and loony. And then over the course of the next sort of 5 to 10 years, that did change. I mean, it was helped enormously by the Time to Change campaign, which was funded by the lottery and run very well by Mind. But it did change. And so we got to 2003 and the Sun, the famous Sun, front page headline, Bonkers Bruno, which they were forced to change after the first edition because, their switchboards were overwhelmed with people saying this is outrageous, who'd picked up on the early editions of the paper. So I think it can change, but in the absence of something like time to change, a funded campaign, and given the time scale we're working to, I suppose I'm not optimistic that we can achieve much while the Casey review is live over the next kind of 2 years or 3 years, if it runs its course. Anyway, but I mean, maybe this is a start. Maybe this is that your book is going to trigger a wider discussion about these things. Well done.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think there is an opportunity with the Casey Commission, and I've heard positive things. I think the Commissioner are kind of out there and listening to people and taking on board what people are saying. So I'm intrigued to see how the Commission frames social care and kind of what language is used in whatever they're putting out, because I think that will be really influential. But I don't know. I mean, the Care Act's been around for over 10 years now, and that was a kind of a reframing, wasn't it? And I don't think it's really kind of hit home. But I think whatever I mean, I'm very like tied into the work of Social Care Future and that idea of trying to really shift the narrative around what social care is all about. And I think whenever it's seen as something that's about them and others, it's very hard to see it as something that's important, isn't it? Whereas if it's something that is about all of us and it's about all of us living really good lives, and we all
Mm.
need some support at different times in our lives and benefit from support, benefit from people around us. And if we kind of shift the way that we think about what social care is all about and see it as people looking out for each other much more, and that we all have a role in that, then it becomes more about all of us rather than it being that kind of support for them over there who are sort of anonymous, the vulnerable, all of that kind of
Mm.
different groups. So yeah, but thank you.
Colin, one last one from you.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, actually links directly to what you just said, Bryony. Back in the early 1990s, some of you may remember the Citizens Charter, which was an attempt by the major government to change the way the state related to people who use public services. Two things from that, which I think are really interesting. The first is it was Citizen apostrophe S Charter. There was a big debate about this in Whitehall, because if you made it citizens without the apostrophe, it implied the citizens had some sort of collective rights. And as at the time, they were busily dismantling lots of collective rights organisations in the health and social care sectors. They wanted to make it clear that this was about individual citizens, not about anything collective and community based. So they put the apostrophe in, which is why it was called the Citizens Charter. The other was that they then told all government departments and agencies that they had to have a charter focused on their area of service. So we had taxpayers' charters and VAT payers' charters and health charters and so on. And the really interesting and funny one was that the prison service started working on a prisoner's charter, which lasted about 5 minutes before they were told they couldn't possibly have something called the prisoner's charter. It had to be called something like incarceration standards or something like that. So that the people in Whitehall think about these sorts of things and they deliberately manipulate the language to try and get the results that they want.
Yeah, I just think that the whole concept of service as well, of public service, we've kind of forgotten that relationship, haven't we? In rather than service, it's very much kind of like telling, control. So yeah, getting back to kind of a genuine concept of service, I think would help.
Well, Bryony, many thanks again, and thanks to all of you for your participation. As yet again, I've not been able to put the questions I wanted to put, but that's only shows what a great discussion it's been. And I must say, it's always great to take part in a discussion where everybody's much better informed than I am about these topics. So it's been really good, very rich. We will post a recording of it. We might edit it a little bit. And sorry about the security breach earlier on. Just to finish by saying, if you haven't read the book, here it is. It's available from all good bookshops, I believe, as well as online. And to let you know that the November book club chat will take place 4 weeks today on Tuesday, November the 18th, and it will be with the author of this book. And focusing on this book, John Seddon, looking at, it's not a new book, it's been around for about 5 or 6 years. I'm pleased to say that in association with John, we can offer a way of getting hold of this, I think, very interesting and significant book at half price. And I think it's again going to be a timely discussion, given that the Health Foundation has just started some research and stimulated a conversation about failure demand, a concept first coined, I think, by John Seddon, and about which there is probably as much misunderstanding as there is understanding. So I'm very much looking forward to that. We'll be promoting that over the next few weeks. But so for now, that's all that remains is to once again thank you all for joining us for such a rich and lively discussion. Thank you, Rose, very much for your preparation for that. But thank you above all, Bryony. Congratulations on the book and good luck with it.